Welcome back to the Power of Prayer. This is part 4, the segment we've titled, One Nation Under God. My name is Richard Blair, and I'll be your host along with our 2 Washington television commentators, Jane Chastain and Ralph Baker, who will be joining us from the historical sites and monuments that we'll be featuring in this program.
The Washington National Cathedral here and other churches like it in our nation's capital wouldn't be here today if it were not for the Christian heritage and the prayers of our forefathers. They prayed because they knew the power of prayer, and they believed that prayer, through Jesus Christ, could accomplish great purposes and achieve supernatural results.
They had faith that God would hear their prayers and answer them as He promised.
Prayer has played a vital role in the birth and the development of this great country of ours. We invite you to stay with us as we look at some of the miracles of prayer that shape this nation and its people.
Thank you, Ralph and Jane. We're looking forward to being on site with you. Following his first visit to America, the famous French philosopher de Tocqueville wrote, "America is great because America is good. If America ever ceases to be good, America will cease to be great."
That essential goodness, as we have seen in the previous programs of this series, has come from an unrelenting reliance on God through the power of prayer. From the moment Columbus set sail into the unknown, the history of America has been a history of people seeking God and the freedom to worship Him according to the dictates of their own conscience.
Our ability to exercise our freedom to worship and to pray as we choose is guaranteed in the very first sentence in the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. From that wellspring, freedom of religion has continued to be the very cornerstone of America's goodness.
As late as 1892, in a landmark decision, the Supreme Court declared, "Our laws and our institutions must necessarily be based upon and embody the teachings of the Redeemer of mankind. It is impossible that it should be otherwise. And in this sense and to this extent, our civilization and our institutions are emphatically Christian. This is a religious people. This is historically true. From the discovery of this continent to the present hour, there is a single voice making this affirmation. We find everywhere a clear recognition of the same truth. This is a Christian nation."
Those are powerful words, but they were written over 100 years ago. Is it still true today? Are we in fact a Christian nation? And would the Supreme Court today stand by that ruling? Jane and Ralph will bring us up to speed by reviewing some of our more recent history.
Congress passed legislation in 1952 ordering the president to proclaim a national day of prayer each year.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
In 1953, the National Prayer Breakfast began. In 1954, Congress added the phrase, "under God," to the Pledge of Allegiance. So it reads, "One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all."
But in the 1950s, the church began to experience a spiritual decline. People began to doubt God's working in the world and even God's very existence. In the early 1960s, the worldview of secular humanism started making its way into United States Supreme Court decisions. Through a case brought before the Supreme Court in 1962 by Madalyn Murray O'Hair on behalf of her son, William Murray, the court struck down teacher-led student prayer. It further banned all religious expression from public schools, claiming that it violated the First Amendment. For the first time in our nation's history, the United States took an official position against God.
In 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that posting the 10 Commandments in public schools was unconstitutional. Numerous other court decisions followed, which further restricted public religious freedom of expression. Efforts to make secular humanism the religion of modern society increased.
During his presidency, Jimmy Carter recognized the spiritual malaise in our country. In July of 1979, he addressed the issue in what became known as his malaise speech.
We are confronted with a moral and a spiritual crisis. In a nation that was proud of hard work, strong families, close-knit communities, and our faith in God, too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns.
Unfortunately, recognizing the spiritual malaise problem has not solved it. Researcher George Barner reports that although 82% of Americans call themselves Christians, only 37% attend services in a given week. Church attendance has gone down every year for the past 5 years.
Almost 3/4 of all adults agree that there is no such thing as absolute truth, and 71% agree there are no absolute standards for morals and ethics. The percentages for Christians are only a few points lower.
And while 3/4 of all adults say it would be very desirable to have a close relationship with God, only 1 in 6 is involved in a small group focusing on prayer, Bible study, or spiritual fellowship. So what does all this mean for the prospect of spiritual renewal in our nation? Barna predicts that America's moral decline will continue, but he also says that America's search for God will continue at full speed.
President Harry S. Truman wrote, "The fundamental basics of this nation's laws were given to Moses on the Mount. The basis of our Bill of Rights comes from teachings in the Bible. I don't think we emphasize that enough these days." And at least 2 other modern presidents believed we were beginning to fully understand the need for the return to moral excellence. Both Ronald Reagan and George Bush did what they could to keep us moving in the right direction spiritually.
And today our country is seeing a rebirth of freedom and faith, a great national renewal. America has begun a spiritual awakening. Faith and hope are being restored. Americans are turning back to God.
President George Bush, like Presidents Carter and Reagan, placed a strong emphasis on prayer and the Bible. He signed a special resolution making 1990 the year of Bible reading.
Could we be experiencing the beginning of the 5th Great Awakening? Remember those 16 all-important words that begin the Bill of Rights. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. But some in our society would like to remove any reference to God from all aspects of public life. At times, the Supreme Court has concurred. Is that what was intended by the words so carefully and thoughtfully crafted by our founding fathers? Jane and Ralph will attempt to discover what the real intent of the founding fathers was, to uncover evidence of what they meant to do. The expressions of our founders' intentions are not tucked away in obscure manuscripts hidden in dusty libraries or in complex legalistic treatises. They are literally chiseled in stone.
Here at the National Archives, our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, and the Bill of Rights are housed and protected.
We hold these truths to be self-evident,
that all men are created equal,
that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights,
that among these rights are life,
liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
The Declaration of Independence marked the official beginning of the United States of America. In that document, and from the time of the very discovery of this country, we included God and diligent prayer in every aspect of our lives. One of the first duties of the newly formed United States Congress, which now meets in this building, was to elect and pay chaplains to open sessions in each chamber with prayer. It also called for a national day of public thanksgiving and prayer. Similar days of prayer have been declared by Congress nearly 200 times since 1789. And in 1803, Congress provided support to the Roman Catholic Church for its work among the Indians. The leaders of our new country had not forgotten God.
There There is evidence of God's mighty hand throughout our nation's capital and her many buildings and monuments. Our country was founded not just as a nation under God, but as a nation of Christians. The 555-foot Washington Monument, a great memorial to the father of our country, reflects Washington's devotion to Christian principles. The capstone of the monument is covered in a metal tip inscribed with the words, "Praise be to God." On carved tribute blocks lining the walls of the stairwell are biblical quotations and Christian references, such as, "Search the Scriptures," "Holiness to the Lord," "Train up a child in the way he should go," and "In God we trust." Situated on a busy street across from our nation's Capitol building is the Supreme Court. Above the east entrance to the court is a carved relief of Moses. He is holding the tablets of the 10 Commandments as a reminder that the foundation of our law in America is the Bible. Also, above the main entrance to the Supreme Court building, the words, "Equal justice under the law," are engraved. This is a biblical concept dating back to the time of Moses. Upon entering the Supreme Court, one finds the 10 Commandments inscribed on the oak doors. Here in this chamber, each session opens with this simple prayer: "God save the United States and this honorable court." The Library of Congress, the world's largest library with a collection of 110 million items, is growing at the rate of 2 million items per year. Here at the library, numerous scriptures can be found on the walls. One of the 8 engravings in the main reading room reminds Americans of what God asks of us. Taken from Micah 6:8, it says, "What doth the Lord require of thee? But to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God." The White House was the first building ever constructed in the nation's capital. The cornerstone was laid in 1792 during George Washington's presidency, and the magnificent structure was completed during the term of our second president, John Adams. A prayer authored by President John Adams is carved into the marble facing of the state dining room fireplace. It reads,
"I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and on all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof."
Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, founder of the University of Virginia, and the 3rd President of the United States. This founding father, and perhaps our most brilliant American statesman, though unorthodox in some of his deistic views, acknowledged reverence of God as necessary for the prosperity of America. From the Jefferson Memorial on the banks of Washington's tidal basin, Thomas Jefferson still speaks through his inscriptions.
God, who gave us life, gave us liberty. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed a conviction that these liberties are the gift of God? Oh, indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever.
Thousands of American soldiers have been buried around Robert E. Lee's former home, noted for its family prayer parlor. The Lee Mansion at Arlington National Cemetery overlooks Washington, D.C., and the graves of President John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert. Both of the Kennedy memorials are inscribed with famous statements from their speeches, as well as references to prayer and seeking God's guidance.
Let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking His blessing and His help.
Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people.
Abraham Lincoln, still admired here and around the world as one of our greatest presidents, relied on prayer through Jesus Christ to guide our country through the Civil War. The Lincoln Memorial is often described as a sacred religious refuge where one can find inspiration. It truly reflects Lincoln's Christian thought and character. The Gettysburg Address. Lincoln spoke these words during our country's darkest days.
That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Without Lincoln's reliance on God and his fervent prayers, our nation indeed might have perished from the earth. The United States Capitol, with its building foundation laid in 1793 by George Washington, reveals the faith of our founding fathers. Even today, every session of the House and Senate begins with prayer. In this 180-foot-high Capitol Rotunda, so high it could house the Statue of Liberty, are paintings depicting our Christian heritage. One is the landing of Columbus, which shows him giving thanks to God. Another is the Christian baptism of the Indian princess Pocahontas. Next to that painting is one depicting the Pilgrim's departure for America. On the sail of that small ship can be seen the phrase, "God with us." Entombed in one of the cornerstones of this great building is Daniel Webster's famous speech, which contains the words, "God save the United States of America." As we walk through our nation's capital, we enter the National Statuary Hall. Each state contributes 2 statues representing 2 outstanding individuals from that state's history. These honored people represent the best in that state's leadership and character.
These 100 special Americans, memorialized in marble or bronze throughout the Capitol building, include not only some of America's greatest leaders, but some of America's greatest Christian leaders as well. Of course, George Washington and Robert E. Lee were both offered by Virginia. But we also see statues of Abraham Lincoln and the Reverend Martin Luther King.
From California, this is Father Junipero Serra, the great Franciscan missionary to the Indians. In the 1770s, he established a series of missions throughout the state of California. This was a Herculean task, considering that Father Serra was already in his 50s and suffered from a chronic ulcer condition in one leg.
Here is Connecticut Governor Jonathan Trumbull, the only colonial governor to support the American Revolution. He was Washington's good friend, and he declared days of prayer and fasting in support of the revolutionary cause.
This is Father Damien, a priest who dedicated his life to helping lepers on the Hawaiian island of Molokai. In the 1870s, he accomplished amazing feats in the area of leprosy care, in addition to building 6 chapels plus homes for boys and girls. He, too, died of leprosy after 16 years of undaunted dedication.
From the state of Oklahoma comes Cherokee Indian sequoia, whose memory is perpetuated in the name of 2 species of California giant redwood trees. Sequoyah invented the Cherokee alphabet prior to 1820, which enabled Cherokees to read and write the scriptures.
Here is Frances Willard, an Illinois Christian social reformer who in the 1880s pioneered the women's Christian temperance movement and promoted higher education. She was associated with evangelist Dwight Moody, and her statue was the first honoring a woman in Statuary Hall.
This is John Winthrop, the colonial governor of Massachusetts for 12 terms. He arrived at Boston in 1630 with 1,800 Puritan settlers. He developed a form of government compatible with Puritan beliefs and ideals.
Roger Williams founded Rhode Island Colony in 1636. His greatest gift to the colonies was his authorship of the Declaration of the Principle of Religious Liberty.
Starting in 1856, Mother Joseph from the state of Washington was directly responsible for establishing 11 hospitals, 7 academies, 5 Indian schools, and 2 orphanages in the Pacific Northwest. She left a legacy of humanitarian service that has never been equaled.
Reverend John Muhlenberg from Pennsylvania told his Woodstock, Virginia congregation one Sunday morning during the United States Revolution, "There's a time to preach and a time to pray." And then, in a voice that sounded like a trumpet blast, he exclaimed, "There is a time to fight, and that time has now come." Then, laying aside his ministerial robe, as depicted by the statue, he stood before his flock in the full uniform of a colonel. Almost the entire male audience, nearly 300 men, enlisted on that day and followed him into battle for American freedom.
Just as our past leaders used prayer to help guide them in the formation of our country and in its leadership, many of our present leaders also pray. Through this alcove, located just off of the main rotunda of the Capitol, is a congressional prayer room. It is reserved for the private prayer and meditation of members of Congress. The central feature of this prayer room is the beautiful stained glass window. Called Washington's Gethsemane, the window depicts the kneeling figure of George Washington at Valley Forge, praying to God for his soldiers and his country. Behind him are etched the words from Psalm 16:1. "Preserve me, O God, for in thee do I put my trust." Above Washington are the words, "This nation under God." Since the dawn of its discovery, the welfare of our nation has relied upon the wisdom of those who sought God through prayer. The need for prayer has not lessened as people become more self-sufficient. Instead, that need has grown exponentially.
It would appear that the founders of America have a different view of the First Amendment than the one currently expressed in the rigid concept of the separation of church and state. Certainly, if the framers of the Constitution and the political leaders of the next 2 centuries had intended such a separation, they had plenty of opportunity to say so and even expunge much of what we've just seen. Instead, the exact opposite seems to have taken place. Let's take a look at what our leaders, then and now, have said about God and prayer.
I have lived, sir, a long time. And the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of man. I therefore beg leave to move that prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessing on our deliberation be held in this assembly every morning.
Among many other things regarding the importance of God and prayer in the founding of the nation, Washington said, "The success which has hitherto attended our united efforts we owe to the gracious interposition of heaven."
I have been driven many times to my knees by the overwhelming conviction that my own wisdom and that of all about me seemed insufficient for the day.
Knowing that intercessory prayer is our mightiest weapon and the supreme call of all Christians, I pleading urge people everywhere to pray.
Henry Ward Beecher told many of his congregations that prayer is the key of the morning and the bolt of the night. In more recent times, former United Nations Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge wrote to the 75 members of the UN, appealing to them to open their meetings with prayer. "I do so in the conviction," he said, "that we cannot make the United Nations into a successful instrument of God's peace without God's help."
President Gerald Ford wrote, "Without God, there could be no American form of government, nor an American way of life. Recognition of the Supreme Being is the first, the most basic expression of Americanism." In a speech before Congress, Senator Robert Byrd said, "In no other place in the United States are there so many and such varied official evidences of deep and abiding faith in God on the part of the government as there are in Washington. The phrase, 'In God we trust,' appears opposite the President of the Senate, who is the Vice President of the United States. The same phrase, in large words, is inscribed in the marble. Every session of the House and Senate begins with prayer. Each house has its own chaplain."
Without God, there is no virtue because there's no prompting of the conscience. Without God, there is a coarsening of the society. And without God, democracy will not and cannot long endure. If we ever forget that we're one nation under God, then we will be a nation gone under.
Former Senator Jennings Randolph of West Virginia said of the then regularly held prayer breakfasts at the U.S. Senate, "At the end, when we join our hands in prayer, you can feel the grips tightening. You sense that we are going out strengthened."
Even the Supreme Court itself, the very institution that redefined the so-called separation of church and state, begins every session of that great court with this simple prayer: "God save the United States and this honorable court." The evidence is clear. It was never the intent of our forefathers to separate God and prayer from our government, our schools, or our public gatherings. Quite the contrary. Why then has this come about? Could it be that God wants us to understand that it really isn't courts and governments that matter here?
In 2 Chronicles 7:14, God promises, "If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land."
Today, perhaps more than at any other time in our history, there's a great need for everyone to realize the importance of prayer, because in the final analysis, it is neither the court nor the government that determines the blessings that are bestowed by heaven. It is each of us, calling upon God through prayer, that will make the difference. It's still true, as the psalmist wrote so many centuries ago, that unless the Lord builds the house, its builders labor in vain. If the evidence of answered prayer over the past 500 years has taught us anything, it's that God answers the prayers of his people. Each of us can change our world through the power of prayer. For the Bible says, when a believing person prays, great things happen.